They expected me to weep and fade away. They expected tears, perhaps, a collapse in the great hall, hands clutching my chest where the bond scars still ached from 3 years of carrying it through mud and blood and siege smoke. They expected the Omega to crumble, to become small, to dissolve into grief the way salt dissolves in rain. They do not know me at all. I am Commander Soren Ashvale. I held the Veyrath Pass for 47 days with 600 men against 4,000. I drew the tactical maps that broke the ironclad Confederacy. I buried my soldiers by firelight and rose before dawn to plan the next assault. I have not wept since my mother's funeral, and I did not weep then either. I stood at her graveside and made a list of every man who had failed to send her the grain I had promised for my campaign wages. I do not weep. I plan. So when I rode through the gates of Valethorn Citadel on a gray morning in the 3rd week of the harvest moon, my chest armor still bearing the fresh slash from a Confederacy blade, and I saw my Alpha King standing on the steps of the throne hall with his hand resting on the waist of a creature I did not recognize, silk-draped, soft-eyed, lifting his chin at the assembled court with the particular arrogance of a man who has never earned a single thing he owns. I did not weep. I felt the bond snap. That is the only word for it. Snap. Like a bowstring pulled past its limit. 3 years I had carried that thread through every campaign, a warm pulse in the base of my sternum that said, "He lives, he waits, return to him." 3 years, I had drawn comfort from it in the coldest nights on the front, when the dead outnumbered the living and the stars above the Veyrath tundra were indifferent and infinite. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, that warmth ceased. Not a cry, not a shudder, just silence, the way a forge goes silent when you drown it. King Aldrich Vane, Alpha of Valethorn, sovereign of the 7 Reaches, did not look at me. He was murmuring something to his silk-draped consort. The consort laughed, a bright crystalline sound that carried across the courtyard, and Aldrich smiled the smile I once believed he reserved only for me. I dismounted. My second-in-command, General Cale Dawnreach, was at my shoulder. He was always at my shoulder, a silent shadow who smelled of iron and cedar smoke. I felt his presence sharpen as he too took in the scene. He said nothing. He rarely did, but I heard the subtle change in his breathing, a thing only 3 years of shared battlefields can teach you to notice. The court watched me. Dozens of courtiers, advisors, and palace servants. They watched to see what the Omega Commander would do. I walked past my Alpha King without a word. I did not bow, I did not salute. I walked up the steps of the citadel, my campaign-worn boots leaving dried mud on the white marble, and I went to find my quarters. The locks had been changed. I stood before the iron-banded door of my war rooms, the suite of chambers I had occupied for 11 years, where every wall bore the ink stain of battle plans, where the shelves held the spoils of 17 campaigns, and I tried my key, and the key did not turn. A palace servant hovered at the corridor's edge, young, visibly terrified. "Speak," I said. The new consort, Commander, Lord Ferris Vale. His Grace requested the chambers 3 months ago. The king approved the reassignment." I looked at the door. "Where are my effects?" A longer pause. "Some were relocated, Commander. The rest?" I pushed the door open. The lock had been changed, but the mechanism was cheap, and I had learned to pick cheap locks when I was 12 in the garrison slums. 3 seconds. The door swung inward. The smell hit me first. Tea. Sweet, floral, aggressively perfumed tea. The war room, that sacred smoke-darkened space where I had spent 10,000 hours plotting the defense of this kingdom, had been transformed into something out of a nobleman's fantasy. lace curtains on the arrow-slit windows, porcelain figurines on the shelves where my campaign journals had lived. A low table set with an elaborate tea service, gilded cups arranged in fussy precision. The maps were gone. The tactical overlays, the territorial surveys, the annotated battle plans I had spent years refining were gone. I crossed to the corner where I had kept my battle cloaks. The campaign cloaks are not merely cloth. Every commander of Veilthorn receives them upon promotion, woven from the wool of Highland aurochs, dyed with the indigo of the royal house, embroidered at the hem with the names of every engagement survived. They are records, they are honors, they are proof of blood paid. Mine were on the floor. Folded but not with care, bunched and dropped the way you treat a disused rag. The embroidered hem of the eldest cloak, the one I had received at 19 for my first independent command at the Battle of Grafen Crossing, was dark with something that looked very much like boot polish. My medals were not on the shelves. I found them in a wastebasket beside the tea table. 17 medals. The Star of Veyrath, the Iron Laurel, the Sovereign's Commendation, awarded personally by Aldrich's father, the Old King, for the relief of the Ostra province siege. All of them in a gilded wicker basket, heaped together like broken costume jewelry. And on the writing desk, the ashes. I recognized the seal, even in fragments. The property documents, land grants awarded to me over 11 years of service, signed by king and council, deeds to 4 border estates that legally belonged to me, had been burned in the desk's brazier. The fire had been recent. I could still feel the warmth of the coals. I stood in the center of what had been my war room, and I breathed. The rage was there. I will not pretend otherwise. It moved through me like floodwater through a canyon, enormous and destructive and seeking an outlet. My hand was steady. It is always steady. I made certain of that long ago. But beneath the steadiness, something vast and cold was taking shape. The rage was folding itself, the way you fold a blade when you forge it, hammering out the impurities, making it denser, making it harder. I was not going to storm into the throne hall. I was not going to confront Aldrich in front of his court. I was not going to give Lord Ferris Vale the satisfaction of seeing me react. I was going to think. I picked up the Star of Veyrath from the wastebasket, turned it in my fingers, set it in my breast pocket, close to where the bond scar ached with its new hollow silence. Then I sat down at the tea table, poured myself a cup of whatever floral nonsense had been brewed, and began making a list. I was still at the table when the screaming started. Not screaming of pain, not immediately, screaming of command. The high, furious voice of someone accustomed to having their orders obeyed instantly and completely, currently experiencing the dissonance of encountering someone who would not obey. I knew the voice of my Hant, Chief Servant Marin Ashvale. Silk-draped, soft-eyed, still wearing that air of borrowed authority like a cloak 3 sizes too large, standing over my aunt with a decorative blade drawn. The blade was thin, more ornament than weapon, but its edge was real. Marin was on her knees, not from submission, but from where she had been shoved. A tray of tea service lay shattered around her. "Late," Ferris Vale was saying, his voice pitched high with the particular tone of a man performing anger for an audience. Several palace servants stood frozen at corridor's end. "The third! The third! Do you understand what that means, you ancient useless?" "Put the blade down." My voice carried the way voices carry in a siege, without elevation, without decoration, simply present at full volume in the bones of everyone nearby. The corridor went silent. Ferris Vale turned. He took in my campaign armor, my road-stained boots, the fresh scar across my chest that the court physician had yet to properly bind. His eyes moved over me with the assessment of a man who has learned to judge value by aesthetics and found me wanting. "And you are who?" "I am the commander of the Veilthorn Vanguard," I said, walking toward him. "I am the architect of every military victory this kingdom has celebrated in the last 11 years. I am the reason the borders you shelter behind have not been breached. I stopped 3 paces from him. You have no authority here, he said. The king has granted me full dominion over. What happened next was very simple. I caught his wrist. I applied the joint lock that my first weapons master taught me at age 13, the one that creates immediate, total compliance without lasting damage. I am not a cruel man. I simply know precisely how much force a situation requires. The blade clattered to the marble floor. Ferris Vale made a sound that was not dignified. I released him, stepped back. Your blade, I said, and nudged it toward him with my boot. I suggest you return to your tea parlor. He gathered his blade and his dignity, the latter with considerably more difficulty, and departed. I knelt beside my aunt. Are you hurt? Marin looked at me with eyes that were bright and steady despite everything. A bruised knee and a broken tea set. I have survived worse, child. You have. I helped her to her feet. Behind us, I heard the low sound of a presence adjusting, the particular shift of someone stepping out of shadow who had been there long enough to become part of it. I did not need to turn. I knew that weight. I knew that silence. General Donreach, I said. Commander. Cale's voice was what it always was, low, measured, the voice of a man who understood that words were tools and wasted none. Cale Donreach was not a beautiful man the way Aldrich was beautiful. The king had a sculpted, deliberate quality, the beauty of something maintained. Cale's face was all angles and economy, a face that had been outdoors in every season for 15 years, that had never learned to arrange itself for court. His eyes were the dark amber of old war glass, and they were fixed at me with an expression I had learned over 3 years to interpret as concern. Your wound, he said, indicating the chest scar. The court physician. Later. Soren. He said my name the way he always said it in private, without rank, without ceremony. It was the only informality he ever permitted himself, and he did it with the carefulness of a man who knows that a single word can be a confession. Later, I said again, come to the armory. There is much to discuss. The garrison armory smelled of oil and iron and the cold mineral breath of stone. It was the one place in the citadel that Ferris Vale had yet to claim, because silk-draped consorts have no interest in rooms that smell of work. I sat on a weapon chest while Cale cleaned and bound my chest wound with the efficiency of a man who had done this across 100 battlefields. His hands were careful. They were always careful when they tended me, in that particular way that is distinct from how he treated anything else. I had seen those same hands snap a sword hilt in half in the middle of a battle press, and I had seen them, on a different evening, handle a wounded soldier's broken forearm with a gentleness that was almost painful to witness. Tell me what I missed, I said. 3 months of it. He told me. His voice was even throughout, the tone of a battle report, but I had learned to read what lay beneath the tone. Lord Ferris Vale had arrived at court 8 months ago, a nobleman's 4th son from the eastern provinces, carrying nothing but his face and an appetite for position. Aldrich had been, Cale paused here, choosing his word, susceptible. The bond had thinned over the years of long campaigns. I had felt it, a slow loosening, the way a rope frays before it breaks. The court had noticed. The court had, as courts do, begun to position itself accordingly. The property documents, I said. Burned 6 weeks ago. I tried to... Another pause. This one is longer. I had no legal authority to prevent it. The king had countersigned the order. I documented everything. Good. I looked at him. You always document everything. I knew you would return. He said it simply, without ornament. I looked at my hands, steady, always steady, and thought about what it meant to be known. Not the knowledge of formal records, of rank and commendation, but the knowledge of pattern, of the way a person moves through crisis. 3 years beside me, and Cale Donreach knew how I worked, the way a craftsman knows his tools. Better, the way a craftsman knows himself. The men, I said, the vanguard, Their loyalty is yours, has been yours since the second month of the Veyrath campaign. If you gave the order to march tomorrow, 6,000 men would follow you out of these gates. I absorbed this, and the king's personal guard. Fractured. Half are men you trained, the other half are loyal to coin, and the treasury has been... He glanced down at his work, tying off the bandage with a precise knot. Lord Vale has expensive tastes. So, the treasury was strained, the vanguard's loyalty was mine, the border garrisons, I ran through them in my mind, commander by commander, every face, every debt owed and favor traded across 11 years, the supply lines, the grain stores, the arrangement with the northern grain lords which I had personally negotiated in the second year of the campaign, a 3-year contract that would require my signature to renew. The cold thing inside me finished taking shape. It was not rage anymore. Rage is fire, it consumes itself. This was a different quality entirely. This was the feeling I got in the moment before a major engagement, when the battle plan locked into final form and I could see all the lines of it, the contingencies, the outcomes, the single clean path through the chaos. I knew exactly what I was going to do. "Cale," I said. He had finished with the bandage. He sat back on his heels, looking up at me. At this angle, in this light, his face was open in a way it never was in company. The careful blankness he wore before the court stripped away, and underneath was something I had been noting for a long time, without permitting myself to examine it directly. "When I was at Veyrath," he stopped. It was unusual. Cale Donreach did not speak sentences and stop them. He was a man who did not speak unless he had already finished the thought. "Continue," I said. "Every morning before the assault lines formed," he looked at his hands, the hands that could break a sword hilt and also tie a precise knot over a wound. "I had a habit, a soldier's habit, before engagement, naming what you are fighting for." I waited. "I named you." He said it to his hands, then looked up. "Every morning for 3 years. Let him survive. Let him be free of the chain that keeps him lesser than he is. I knew the bond was wrong for you. I knew it had been wrong since before the first campaign. You were the sharpest mind in any room in this kingdom, and the bond kept you diminished, kept you always one step below a man who had never earned the ground he stood on." His jaw tightened. "I prayed for it to break. And then I prayed harder because a selfish part of me wanted to be there when it did." The armory was very quiet. I thought about 47 days in the Veyrath Pass. The cold, the dead, the mornings when the only warmth in the world was the distant pulse of the bond thread in my chest. A thread I had understood even then was fraying, but had clung to because it was the only anchor I had. And I thought about the presence at my shoulder, the silent weight of him. Every tactical discussion held in low voices over campaign maps, every field decision checked against his, the particular quality of his attention when I was working through a problem, total, focused, never intrusive, always there. I had named it many things over 3 years: trust, camaraderie, the bond that forms between soldiers who have bled together. I had declined to name it the thing it actually was, because naming it felt like a betrayal, and I had not yet understood that some betrayals are performed against you rather than by you. "I know," I said. He looked at me. "I have known for some time," I said. I did not permit myself to look at it directly. "I understand you know why." "Yes." "The bond is gone." "Yes." "I am going to dismantle this court. Not in a day, not with a sword. I am going to remove every pillar that holds Aldrich's reign upright, one by one, until he is standing in a palace full of pretty furniture, with no treasury, no army, and no one who will answer his summons. And then I am going to walk out of this kingdom." Cale's expression did not change, but there was something in his eyes, the war-glass amber, that was not the carefully managed stillness I usually saw there. "Walk out to where?" he asked. "To whatever comes next," I met his gaze. I intend to build something that does not rot at the center. A military protectorate, merit-based, no inherited rank, no empty titles, the sort of thing this kingdom should have been. You will need a general. I will need the general, I said. There is only one. A long quiet. Soren, my name again with that careful wait. After, when the work is done, I want to... He stopped himself again, and I realized that Cal Donreach, who had walked into a dozen sieges without flinching, was afraid of this particular sentence. Say it plainly, I said. We are not courtiers. I want to be your mate, he said, if you will have me. I'm not asking now because you are wounded and the bond break is fresh, and I will not be the man who rushes into a void. But I am telling you my intention, so that you know what I am working toward. In the aftermath of everything, the broken bond, the desecrated chambers, the wastebasket of metals, the cold shape of what I was about to set in motion, this was the thing that very nearly undid my composure. Not with grief, with something that felt dangerously like relief. I know your intention, I said. I have known for some time. Finish the campaign first, then we will discuss terms. The corner of his mouth, just barely, moved. Terms, he said. Of course. I began the next morning. The first thing I did was visit the border garrison quartermaster, a blunt, practical woman named Sergeant Major Virat, who had served under me at Austria and Grafen both. I explained, in the stripped language of logistics, that the Central Treasury's grain allocation to the eastern border garrisons would need to be rerouted. Not cut, rerouted, through channels that I personally administered as the commanding officer of the Vanguard, a position whose logistical authority had never been formally rescinded because Aldrich, in his enthusiasm for his new consort, had neglected to restructure the chain of command. Virat looked at me, looked at the orders I had drafted signed with my commander's seal, looked back at me. The king, I said, has not updated the supply protocols in 14 months. My authority over the eastern supply chain predates his current domestic arrangements by 7 years. Do you have a legal objection to these orders? She did not. The grain went east. The second thing I did was call in 3 years' worth of outstanding favors from the northern grain lords. I had negotiated their contract personally. It was my seal on the renewal agreement, not the Crown's. I informed them that I would be handling the renewal directly, outside the palace's commercial office, and that the new terms would route their payments through a military supply account rather than the Crown's treasury. The northern grain lords, who had a long memory for which signatures had protected their trade routes from Confederacy raiders, agreed without significant resistance. The third thing I did was speak to the men. Not formally, not in ranks. I moved through the barracks the way I had moved through campaign camps, present, unhurried, speaking to individuals in small groups, asking about their families, their grievances, their pay arrears, which had apparently been mounting for 6 months because Lord Vale's renovation of the East Wing had consumed the relevant funds. I listened, I documented, and I made no promises that were not already within my legal authority to keep. By the end of the first week, the Treasury had not yet noticed what was happening. Supply chains are vast and slow. The signals of disruption take time to reach the center. Lord Ferris Vale was busy overseeing the installation of a decorative fountain in the inner courtyard, and Aldrich was, I received reports, spending the majority of his time in private audience with his consort. Cale managed the military side with the precision that had made him legendary along the entire Eastern Front. The Vanguard's loyalty required no persuasion. It had already been established over 3 years. He simply organized it, the way you organize a force for a campaign, ensuring lines of communication, establishing contingencies, making certain that every man understood his role when the moment came. We did not speak about personal matters during this period. There was too much work, and we were both people who understood the necessity of sequence. But each evening, when the day's logistics had been settled and the documents were drafted and the messengers dispatched, we sat across from each other in the garrison's map room and planned, and the easy precision of our shared understanding, that fluid, unspoken quality of minds that have learned to function as a single instrument, was its own kind of intimacy. 3 weeks into the restructuring, the palace began to feel it. The first sign was the commissary shortages. The palace kitchens, which drew from the central supply, found their grain deliveries running thin. The palace steward submitted a query to the treasury. The treasury, confused, began an investigation into the supply chain, at which point they discovered that a significant portion of the eastern allocations had been legally rerouted by standing military orders that predated Lord Vale's tenure and had never been revoked. Aldrich summoned me. I attended the summons without haste. Arriving in the throne room in my formal commander's uniform, I had, by this point, retrieved my battle cloaks from Lord Vale's key parlor and stood before my Alpha King with the composed attention of a subordinate officer receiving a briefing. He was still beautiful. I noted this the way I would note the quality of a blade, aesthetically, without attachment. He looked, I thought, slightly thinner than I remembered. The comfortable ease he had worn at my return had been replaced by something less settled. Lord Ferrus Vale stood at his side, and his soft eyes, I was pleased to observe, held considerably less certainty than they had in the corridor over my aunt. Competence tends to have this effect. "Explain the supply situation," Aldrich said. "Certainly," I said. "The eastern border garrison supply routes are administered under Commander's Protocol 7, which I established in the second year of the Veyrath campaign in response to Confederate interdiction of standard supply lines. The protocol gives the Vanguard commander independent logistical authority over the eastern third of the kingdom's military supply chain. This authority has never been amended or revoked." "Reroute it back." "I cannot do that at present," I said. "The eastern garrisons are in a period of elevated alert. Confederate remnants have been testing the border for the last month. You would have received my field reports if the courier office were processing military correspondence on its previous schedule." A pause. "The correspondence schedule appears to have been disrupted when the military courier office was temporarily purposed as a receiving hall for Lord Vale's furnishings. I have submitted a formal request for its restoration." The silence in the throne room was absolute. "You're doing this deliberately," Aldrich said. "I am managing the eastern border," I said, "as I have been managing it for 11 years. I would be glad to discuss any specific administrative concerns at your convenience. Is there anything else?" Lord Vale's soft eyes were no longer soft. They were narrow and bright with a calculation that was, I noted, both too slow and too obvious. He was realizing, perhaps for the first time, that the Omega he had dismissed as a cast-off was not a cast-off at all. He was realizing that the court he had waltzed into, all silk and entitlement, was actually a machine, and that the machine had a mechanic, and the mechanic had just stopped maintaining it for his benefit. "Soren," Aldrich's voice had dropped. He was using, I recognized, the tone from before the campaigns, before the slow erosion, the tone I had once found compelling. "We should speak privately." "I prefer to conduct official business in official settings," I said, "for the record." He stared at me. In his eyes was something complicated, confusion, frustration, the beginning of something that looked very much like dawning comprehension. Too late, I thought. 3 years and a bond snap too late. "You are my—" He stopped. He could not quite finish the sentence because we both knew what I had been and what the new markings on his neck indicated I no longer was. "I am the commander of the Valethorn Vanguard," I said, "and your border is getting thinner by the month. I suggest you devote your attention to that." I left the throne room. Behind me, I heard Lord Vale say something in a low, venomous voice, and I heard the silence with which Aldrich received it, and I thought, he is beginning to understand the accounting. Good. Understanding the accounting was the first step. The border situation deteriorated over the following month in the way I had projected it would. Confederate remnants are not in themselves a mortal threat to Valethorn. The Confederacy was broken. I broke it. But broken armies do not vanish, they fragment into raiding bands, and raiding bands are patient, and they test borders constantly looking for gaps. The eastern border had been properly fortified and staffed throughout the campaign years because I had specifically designed it to be so. Left without proper supply and its administrative oversight disrupted, it began to strain. I was managing the strain. This is important to note. I was not creating the vulnerability. I was managing an existing one that Aldrich's neglect, his inattention to military affairs over the past year, his consumption in domestic matters, had already allowed to develop. I was managing it competently. The eastern border was, under my direct administration, more stable than it had been in 8 months. The difference was that the treasury was no longer the conduit. The palace felt this, month by month. The commissary shortages became persistent. The Southern Guard's pay arrears could not be resolved because the funds were genuinely not present in the Crown accounts. The King's personal guard, half of whom were men I had trained, began appearing at garrison mess halls for their meals. In the 4th month, the Palace Council sent a formal request for a strategic briefing on border security. I provided it, in writing, in comprehensive detail, with attachments. The briefing made clear in the stripped language of military logistics exactly what the kingdom's defensive position was and what it required to maintain it. The briefing made clear, between its precise lines, that the kingdom's defensive position was contingent on the continued involvement of its current military command structure, specifically on the commander of the vanguard and the Alpha General. The council read the briefing 3 times according to what my sources indicated. Then they called an emergency session. Then Aldrich came to find me himself. He found me in the garrison map room where I was reviewing the latest border assessments with Kale. It was late evening, the torches were burning low, and the maps were spread across the long table, covered in the particular notations that only Kale and I could read in full, a private language of marks and symbols developed over the years. Aldrich stood in the doorway. He had come without guards, without ceremony. He was wearing plain court clothes, not his formal regalia, and he looked smaller than I had ever seen him, not diminished in stature, diminished in the way that men become diminished when the scaffolding they have been standing on is removed and they discover they do not know how to stand without it. Kale looked at him, looked at me, and said nothing. He stood where he was. He would not leave unless I asked him to, and I was not going to ask. The council says we have 6 weeks before the border situation becomes a formal crisis, Aldrich said. He was not, I noted, framing this as a command. He was framing it as information. The shift was telling. They say the only person with sufficient operational knowledge to resolve it quickly is you. I said, they are correct. What do you want? He asked. Name your conditions. I had prepared for this conversation. I had prepared for it thoroughly, but I did not consult my notes because I did not need them. I have no conditions, I said. I have a departure schedule. He stared at me. I am resigning my commission, I said. General Donreach and I are departing Valethorn in 14 days. We will be taking with us the 1,200 veterans of the original Vanguard who have requested transfer, along with the supply contracts I personally negotiated with the Northern Grain Lords, which are legally mine to transfer, as my personal business agreements. You cannot. I can. I have reviewed the relevant law thoroughly. None of what I have described violates the terms of my service contract, which, I note, was never formally terminated when you altered my domestic status. The contract remains valid. It specifies a 60-day departure notice for voluntary resignation. I filed that notice 3 weeks ago with the council secretary. You may verify this. The silence in the map room was complete. Soren, he said. My name the way he had once said it in private, and I heard in it the shape of what he wanted, for me to be moved by it, to soften, to allow the old gravity to pull me back. What I did, I understand it was, I was not. I am not asking for an apology, I said. I am not interested in one. You burned my property deeds and gave my chambers to a man who used my battle cloaks as foot rags. Those facts are not remedied by apology. They are simply facts. And they tell me everything I need to know about the value you assign to what I am. The bond is gone, I said it, without emphasis, without cruelty, as a statement of weather. It has been gone since the day I returned. I do not mourn it. I spent 11 years anchored to it in the belief that it meant something, and what I have learned is that it was a chain with a pretty name. I looked at him clearly, without hatred and without warmth. You are not a bad man, Aldrich. You are an insufficient one. I wish you a capable successor to manage your borders. I returned to my maps. He stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then I heard his footsteps retreat down the corridor. Cale said nothing for 30 seconds. Then, 14 days. 14 days. Where are we going? I put my finger on a point on the map. The Northern Highlands, above the Grainlord territories. High ground, defensible, with access to 3 trade routes and 2 rivers. Land that had been considered marginal and left unclaimed because no one had done the logistical math to see its potential. I had done the math. I had been doing the math for 3 years. There, I said. He leaned over the map, studying it. I watched his face work through the assessment, terrain, supply lines, defensive positioning, growth potential. The same face I had watched calculate 1,000 battle problems. Then, slowly, a nod.
A fortress, he said. A year to build, 2 to fortify, 3 to make it a seat of power, merit-based governance, military protectorate and structure, civilian in administration. Every position earned, none inherited. I looked at him. Do you object to any part of this plan? None. Then there is one other matter to settle, I said. I reached into my breast pocket and removed the Star of Veyroth. I had been carrying it since I retrieved it from the wastebasket. It was a heavy thing, gold and iron in the manner of the old awards, a 5-pointed star with the citadel embossed at its center. I set it on the map between us. The terms, you mentioned, in the armory. Cale looked at the metal, looked at me. The war-glass amber of his eyes was doing something I had not seen it do before, something unguarded and entirely unstrategic. I am not asking now, he said carefully. I said I would not. I am asking now, I said, on my own terms, in my own time, which is, as you should understand by now, the only way I do anything. A long quiet. Soren, he said, are you... Do not ask me if I am certain. I have been certain for longer than either of us have been comfortable admitting. The bond is gone, and I find I do not miss it the way I expected. What I would miss... I stopped, reorganized. The past 3 years would have been unendurable without you. I do not intend the next 3 to be spent with you at my shoulder when you could be at my side. The map room was very still. Cale Dawnreach, who had walked into sieges without blinking, who had not shown an uncontrolled emotion in all the years I had known him, reached across the map table and placed his hand over mine. Then I am at your side, he said, from this moment and past any I can name. On the 14th day, we rode out of Valethorn Citadel at dawn. 1,200 veterans of the vanguard rode with us, men and women whose faces I knew, whose histories I had been present for, whose loyalty had been built through shared blood and shared purpose over years. The supply wagons carried what was legally ours. The grain contracts traveled as documents in my saddlebag, properly witnessed and sealed. Lord Ferris Vale watched from an upper window as we departed. I did not look up. He was not relevant to my accounting. I had heard, through the garrison grapevine, that the palace household staff had begun to quietly organize their own negotiations. The palace steward had submitted a resignation. The head cook, a solid woman who had fed the garrison for 20 years, had asked for a transfer to the Northern Territories. These were small things. They would accumulate. The council, I was told, had convened an emergency session the night before our departure.
They were in the process of drafting an appeal to the remaining garrison commanders. The border situation was formally classified as a crisis. I had left them a comprehensive set of tactical recommendations filed with the council secretary, free of charge. I had also left the names of 3 competent military officers who could manage the eastern border adequately if given appropriate authority and resources. I am not a vindictive person. I do not want Valethorn's people to suffer for their king's failures. The king, however, will have to live with what he has made. A crown is just metal without the soldiers who believe in it. A throne is just furniture without the strategist who keeps the borders behind it standing. Aldrich Vane had a beautiful consort and a hollow kingdom, and he would spend the years ahead learning the difference between the 2 kinds of wealth. That was his accounting, and I left him to it. We built the fortress in the Northern Highlands. It took, as Cale had projected, just over a year for the first walls. He commanded the construction the way he commanded everything, with total efficiency and zero waste, adjusting for terrain and season, doing in 11 months what a lesser planner would have required 2 years to accomplish. I managed the civil architecture, the governance protocols, the merit assessment systems, the trade agreements with the northern grain lords who found, to their considerable interest, that the new Northern Protectorate was a more reliable trade partner than the Central Crown had been in some years. People came. Not many at first. Soldiers who had followed us out of Valethorn and their families, craftspeople from the border settlements who had grown tired of the instability, a handful of court scholars who had submitted transfer requests, apparently on the theory that a merit-based protectorate might treat them more equitably than a court run by aesthetic preference.
By the end of the 2nd year, we had a town. By the end of the 3rd, it was growing toward a small city, and the walls I was standing on as I looked south were solid enough to withstand any conventional siege. I stood on those walls at dawn on the morning of the 3rd anniversary of our departure from Valethorn, and I thought about ash and iron and the cold, ringing silence where the bond had been, and how neither of those things hurt anymore. Cale came to stand beside me. He smelled of cedar smoke and iron, as he always did, and his shoulder was warm against mine in the highland chill. Below us, the fortress, Ashvale Astion they had named it, after my family name, a thing I had neither requested nor prevented, was waking. The morning watch was changing, the kitchens were lit, the training yards were beginning to fill with the controlled noise of people who had chosen to be here, who had earned their place here, who answered to competence rather than bloodline. "Reports from the south," Cale said. "Tell me." "Valethorn has petitioned the Northern Merchant Alliance for a trade agreement, 3rd time this year. The alliance has declined, citing unstable governance." He paused. "There are rumors that the Palace Council is in negotiation with 2 of the southern noble houses about a formal power-sharing arrangement. The king's authority is contested." "And Lord Vale?" "Still in the palace, by all accounts, though the household staff situation is apparently quite dire. He is managing the kitchens himself now." I considered this, felt briefly something that was not quite satisfaction, closer to the feeling you get when a long calculation resolves correctly, the equation balancing. "And the eastern border?" "Holding. The officers I recommended are competent. The people there are managing." A pause. "You wrote good recommendations." "I always do." Below us, the city moved in its morning rhythms. A child ran across the training yard, scolded by a laughing soldier. 2 scholars walked in deep discussion near the archive building, the archive I had commissioned in the 2nd year, because a merit-based society requires records, requires memory. The smoke from the kitchens rose straight up in the still air, and the sky above the northern highlands was the pale, luminous gray of new iron. I had a scar across my chest where a Confederacy blade had found me. I had a silence in my sternum where the bond had been, but it was a clean silence now. The silence of a room that has been cleared and properly organized, not the hollow silence of something broken. At my left side, Cale Donreach bore his mark on the curve of his jaw, small,
precise, placed where mine had first marked him on a cold evening in the armory, when we had both understood that enough time had passed and enough work had been done. I bore his at the base of my throat, where I could feel it when I placed my fingers there. I did this, occasionally, when the weight of governance was heavy, not for comfort precisely, for orientation. "What do you need?" he asked. He was looking at the horizon, the way he always looked at horizons, assessing. "Nothing," I said. "I have everything the accounting requires." He turned then and looked at me directly, the war glass amber, steady and warm, and I thought about 47 days in the Veyrath Pass and the presence at my shoulder that had never wavered, and the prayers he had said each morning before the assault lines formed. Let him survive. Let him be free. "The council session is at the second bell," I said. "I know." "You will attend." "I am always at your side," he said. "You know this." I did know this. I had known it for longer than was comfortable to admit, and I had made my peace with knowing it, and with the particular warmth of being known in return. Being seen clearly, in full, the commander and the strategist, and the person underneath both, and found worth the staying. Below us, Ashvale Bastion breathed in its morning rhythms, and the northern highlands stretched away to the horizon, and everything that needed to be built was being built piece by piece in the clean and lasting way of things made by people who have chosen each other on purpose. I had survived the front lines. I had survived the betrayal. I had outlasted the man who thought a crown was a substitute for character, and I had built something that would outlast us both. The accounting, in the end, was simple. He burned my maps. I drew better ones. He trashed my trophies. I earned new ones. He thought he had won because he had a throne. He forgot that thrones are built by the people willing to hold the walls. I turned from the horizon and went to govern my kingdom. The end.